As Malin mentioned, I'm Shansung. I run field engineering for the West and Asia Pacific, so Director of Solutions Engineering.
I'm Chris Tenike, and I'm Senior Solution Engineer out of the West, work strategic accounts, et cetera.
Yeah. And you guys are here for Mastering Workload Identity. It is a little bit of we engage in some hyperbole to get you in the room because no one is going to walk out of here being a master of workload identity. I know. If you want to leave now, you can. But I think today what we want to do is, Chris and I work with customers every day, and it runs the gamut on workload identity. Some customers come to us, we're just in the initial phases. What is workload identity? How do we implement it? How are you guys involved? And that goes all the way to customers who already have a identity or workload identity engine running, and they're looking for X509 certificates to power it and make sure that they've got a solid foundation for their workload identities across their entire infrastructure. So today we're going to go from basics to all the way to, as Malin mentioned, we've got a demo here where Chris is going to show some pieces around one of the components of workload identity and one of the places that we're seeing it most often used, but it's really proliferating and expanding really quickly. So we're going to go through it all. If there's any questions as we work through it, please feel free to jump in. And again, we'll triage and make sure that we get to all the questions, but it might be here, it might be at the end, or even in the garage for a post-workshop conversation. So, sound good? Okay. So workload identity is the next big problem in trust. So who here is with an organization that's already got a workload identity stance, is leveraging workload identity within their infrastructure ecosystem? That can't be right. Just one of you guys? All right, fine. All right. Well, so then we're going to spend 45 minutes on the basics. So it's not uncommon. I think a lot of organizations have started to look at workload identity. So when we say, what does it mean that you've implemented workload identity? I think that also covers a really broad range of outcomes within an organization. Usually it's on the DevOps side first, or sort of agile infrastructure, and then we go from there, right? So why is it the next big problem, and where do we come from where workload identity became important? So some of this will be some of you may have heard it before. There's going to be some buzzwords and things like that, but it's all really relevant, right? So we had human identity, we moved to machine identity, right, as we realized that more secure and more robust forms of identification were needed, or identity were needed for machines, right? And so we really started to deploy certificates to laptops, workstations, mobile devices, pretty much every single thing that could be connected, a lot of times could not be connected, was starting to get a certificate, right? So we spent quite a few years in hey, machine identity is big. One of the big reasons for that was, of course, zero trust, right? So we were moving from the walled garden, where we're just checking to let people in, to sort of that zero trust infrastructure, heterogeneous environments, cloud, hybrid, on-prem. So everything was machines, right? So this isn't a machine trust or zero trust conversation, but of course that's pervasive through why workload identity is important. We're starting to move away from machine identities, disparate servers, appliances, things like that, and moving into microservices, code applets getting served from the cloud, things like that. We're all familiar with that, right? The important thing here is that we're all consuming those microservices, those applications in a more dynamic manner. They still need identity, and not only that, the concept of the walled garden has shattered even further as we're starting to fracture those even machine identities into more disparate services and applications and services, microservices in multiple clouds coming from our on-prem data center. So that heterogeneous environment has expanded even further, right? So that's where workload identity comes in. So when we talk about workloads, what is workload, right? Does anyone have a good answer to what is workload? No one. Okay, That's fine. I love to hear myself talk, so I can talk forever. I see several customers here that I've been on calls with, so I could go on, but I'm going to keep asking the questions. If anyone wants to jump in at any time, that's totally fine. So what's a workload? I think I just went through it a little bit. It's sort of, I think the broad definition is essentially a microservice or an application that takes up compute, takes up some of those disparate resources that we used to assign to a server or some bare metal or whatever. We're breaking those up. Those are workloads. They're serving something, and traditionally it's been more sort of cloud-oriented, but we're seeing a lot of workload identity that's also necessary on-prem or on-prem data centers or on-prem Kubernetes instances. Right? We've got a lot of customers that are really coming to scale on things like Tanzu and OpenShift in bare metal. So it really has now proliferated cloud, on-prem, however you're going to consume those microservices, those workloads. You're going to have those everywhere now. So it's sort of moved away from just cloud. So that's a workload, right? It's just breaking up of those to disparate pieces. Now, here's where we start when we say it's the next big problem in trust, right? Why does that microservice need an identity? Well, like I said, we're really seeing these microservices across clouds. How many people here have a multi-cloud presence? Like, who here is in more than just AWS and Azure and GCP? All right, we've got 3 people, 4 people. All right, it's starting at 5. All right. So we're starting to see, a lot more customers adopt multi-cloud. A lot of customers doing hybrid deployments. It makes sense. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, and different cloud providers have different advantages as well. And there's also the financial side of it, where you can optimize marketplace spend and things like that. This is more of a technical conversation, but we do see customers out of necessity start to deploy in multiple clouds, start mixing your deployments. So all these microservices, right, start talking across the clouds, start talking into your environment, out of your environment, and that is really why Zero Trust is important, right? We want to validate every single identity, and that includes these workloads, right? The crossing of those environments, right, that's really one of the most critical problems around how we do trust, right, is I've got something coming out of Azure that belongs to Keyfactor. Let's say we'll use our company as an example. If we've got an Azure, and we have Azure, we have AWS. If any of you have looked at our SaaS solutions or our cloud solutions, you can deploy in any cloud you want. We also deploy in multiple clouds, our SaaS products. If we have something that needs to talk from Azure to AWS, why is it important that these workload identities can trust each other? If we don't have that sort of common workload identity or common workload identity provider, we're going to run into all kinds of issue around trust, right? How do I know that I can have this thing access that thing? How do I know that I, as a user, can access a resource in the cloud or consume a resource in the cloud, right? So again, it's all about, and I'm assuming that most people here, your Keyfactor customers, we're a PKI company. That certificate is such an important piece of collateral to provide as a credential or an identity to access resources, consume resources across all your different environments that make up your organizational infrastructure, right? So this is it's really just expanding the scope of how we access, how we consume, who's allowed to access what, right? These are things that we're very used to from a certificate problem, PKI problem, certificate authority problem, right? These are the same solutions, but just writ large, right? Scale, everything else becomes more complicated, or in some ways, maybe a little more less complicated, but we'll get into that in a second. So these are all problems that you need to solve with workload identity, right? So one quick thing that we've heard or we've seen across organizations is, what's wrong with just using secrets to access different things across different clouds? And there's nothing wrong with secrets per se, right? Like passwords, tokens, things like that. So why is it really important to talk about certificates as that piece of collateral that you're going to leverage for workload identity? And that's what we're all here to talk about is certificates, workload identity. The reason is that certificates provide really critical things that we think map to identities versus a user password versus even a token that you rotate or things like that, is because you provide expiration and you provide trust around that certificate. That's the whole point of PKI, right? Is that you're, for those who, they call it something else now, I forget what, but you have your integrity, confidentiality, and non-repudiation from a certificate. And that is critical for workload identity, to provide those three key principles across your different environments and as an identity that a password doesn't have or a long-lived credential doesn't have, right? That's the advantage of using something like a certificate over just a normal secret. And that's what we sort of saw at the beginning of workload identity in sort of the nascent stages before. And we'll go into a little more into why PKI is so heavily involved in workload identity. But originally, we had a lot of secrets being used as workload identity before we realized, hey, we need to have the same kind of things that we established for human identity and machine identity in workload identity, because you need those same kinds of assurances across your, to validate identity for access, for, consuming and provisioning services. So, how do we issue and manage workload identities? So that's a great question. And I'll pause. Does anyone have any quick questions? Since there's a little more of a Q&A kind of piece here. All right. All right, let's keep rolling then. All right, so how do we issue and manage workload identities? So that's a great question. What we see is that the landscape is evolving and moving very quickly. So we've been involved, Keyfactor and Prime Key, which is now EJBCA. The landscape, we're involved with a lot of security working groups in the DevOps space, in the cloud native space, around a lot of these technologies. And honestly, every week something changes, something breaks, and there's a lot of move quick and take into account security later. I think there's the common joke that there's no security in DevOps, or that's why we have DevSecOps, right? So we see that in workload identities, and of course we're for PKI that we have old financial institutions, new startups out of Silicon Valley, and they all have PKI, and they all need workload identities, but they all approach PKI in a slightly different way or consume it slightly differently. And what we see is that every day something changes, the different way to consume certificates. So as Keyfactor, we've constantly had to sort of change, be involved in these security working groups and things like that, so we can make sure that we're on top of, hey, how does a service mesh consume certificates? That is changing. How does Kubernetes consume certificates? That is changing, right? The new workload identity frameworks that we're here to talk about today, how that changes, and that is a constantly evolving landscape. So one thing that we do as a partner is we stay on top of that, because that's our bread and butter, is to make sure PKI interfaces with these technologies as we continue to progress, right? So going through these sort of foundational pieces around, I'm just gonna get my phone out so I have a, so first, rely on standards. So that's one of the things that we see in a fractured landscape. We've already worked with a lot of sort of workload identity providers and different frameworks. Now we see some pretty at least emergent standards from an identity framework perspective, but now there's a lot of different technologies that sort of differ on how to consume X509 into that workload identity, so it's just constantly changing. But some of the criticalities are that workload identity framework should rely on a standard. So we see a lot of SPIFFE now, and who here has not heard of SPIFFE? Don't be ashamed. Okay. Great, a few people. SPIFFE, you may hear a lot of SPIFFE and SPIRE. So SPIFFE has emerged as sort of the current leader. Those of us who have been through Kubernetes and service mesh and 10 major vendors to 8 major vendors, 3 major vendors to maybe 2 or 3 major vendors now. There's been a lot of sort of solutions floated, a lot of IETF drafts, a lot of different proposals. I think we see a lot of our customers, and again, that's what we're here for, is what do we see our customers doing? Because I think that often can provide other customers sort of indications on where the market's moving or what might be the standard that's going to come out and that most customers are going to align to. So we see SPIFFE as a workload identity framework that is pretty popular. They have a reference implementation, SPIRE, so we're very, very familiar with and technical partners with the creators of SPIFFE and SPIRE. But SPIRE is a reference implementation, right? So it's open source. So we have a lot of customers that are also implementing SPIRE, and we're going to talk a little more about SPIRE in a couple slides. But again, those are often changing. The open source products, for those of you who are familiar with working with open source products and consuming open source products, that is often something that at some point you may look to move to an enterprise product because, again, there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of change that continues to come down the pipe. And so, for those of you who are enterprise customers, that's an important thing to keep in mind. But again, relying on standards, things that implement X509, things that use SPIFFE, JOTS, things like that, that is going to be your foundational piece around, hey, how do we issue workload identities? What defines what a workload identity is and how these heterogeneous environments consume them? That's very important as you start to explore the workload identity space. Like, I want to make sure that I'm aligning to what the industry is going to align to, because that's going to ensure that when you're in multi-cloud or when you're starting to combine hybrid environments, when those things are trying to consume workload identities, that you're using a solution that's going to map across all the other products that are out there. You want to understand how to leverage the workload identities. We've had customers who, and I don't want to cast aspersions on anything, but like we've worked with several of the the major cloud providers, right? And they all have their workload identity solutions, which are great, but don't really work across environments, right? That aren't able to let you provision identity to anything other than in that cloud. And so we have a lot of customers that come to us where we're consuming this workload identity service, but we can't use it outside these use cases that live in this cloud. And in the meantime, we've got data center, we've got other environments, our SSO or OAuth provider can't consume these workload identities either, so we're in a bind, right? And what do we do? So make sure that whatever solution that you're evaluating or looking at, or for those of you who are already well along that migration path, make sure that that workload identity solution can continue to scale with where your organization is looking to move, right? Ensure that you're supporting infrastructure, and this is a little bit of a EJBCA kind of pitch, but ensure that your supporting infrastructure meets the availability and reliability needs. So one thing I mentioned was, or one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that when we talked about moving from human identities to machine identities to now workload identities, one of the biggest things that's caught a lot of our customers off guard is just the kind of scale that you need to consume certificates at each step of your journey. Human identity, it's like how many employees do you have? Maybe 3x that. That might be your sort of your identity certificate need. Even 10x that, great. When we started talking about machine identities, that was the next step, right? Now it's every human identity plus every machine probably needs 3 to 5 certificates, depending on where they, VPNs, firewalls, et cetera. So that scale jumped again. Now when we talk about workload identity, right, we're breaking up every single thing that is a machine identity, a human identity, and also multiple components of all your services, your applications, up in the cloud, on-prem, if you've built availability into it, those all need certs. And that is an exponential growth in certificate consumption, certificate issuance, revocation, validation, all these pieces of infrastructure, right? They all need a certificate. And again, that's scaled exponentially. We saw that a bit with, as DevOps technologies like Kubernetes really took place, where, one of the big things about why PKI has seen such a resurgence is that I talked about those sort of cornerstones of what a certificate represents, right? We've realized that that is fantastic, and nothing really does it better for MTLS, right? And that's such a critical, so mutual TLS, identity, between all these pods, all these services within these DevOps deployments. That is just, it's been the cornerstone of a lot of the DevOps platforms that we've seen emerge, service mesh, container orchestration, et cetera, right? So being able to ensure that secure encrypted communication between all of these microservices, that's what's sort of given the rise to this resurgence in PKI, and we're seeing that as workload identity becomes more and more important, right? And then lastly, making sure that as that, let me talk quickly about availability. Before, identity certs, machine certs, or rather machine certs, human certs, we've seen anywhere from, some of this is not very PKI friendly nowadays, but we've seen 10-year identity certs, 3-year identity certs. For cab form stuff, right, it's down to a year and will soon be reducing, but that's still a very long timeline, for renewal, right? If you go and get a cert and you need to renew that cert within 3 months, you could start that renewal process for 2 weeks before, and even if there was a 1-day outage or 2-day outage or whatever, no one wants that from the PKI, but some kind of outage, you have a lot of lead time for that service to come back up and renew that cert, so you don't suffer an outage or you don't suffer an expired cert or whatever, right? But with sort of the DevOps technologies and workload identity, these are ephemeral certs usually. And that's one of the, that short-lived cert is a way to guarantee some of that security around that secret, right? Around that credential, around that identity. So we're seeing 8-hour certs, 12-hour certs, 1-day certs, 1-week certs. And so the availability of the infrastructure supporting those workload identities has become much more critical, right? You need to make sure that that's a service that's, I heard someone say that there was something that was like 11 nines. Someone was promising a service that was 11 nines. It's not, I feel like that's marketing, but you need nines to support that infrastructure around issuance, around revocation, around revocation validation, because the volume of the certs, like if you can't get a cert for your workload, then something is dying. If you can't get a identity cert for your pod, that service does not come up, right? If your cluster can't get a cert from its CA, that cluster is crashing, right? So these are essentials in making sure that supporting infrastructure is highly available, highly redundant, can support the scale that you need, because again, it's a whole new ball game when it comes to workload identity in terms of the scale. Lastly, ensuring visibility, monitoring, and auditability. So there is certain visibility and certain kinds of metrics that you're going to need to have around your PKI, around your workload framework, along all the other pieces of supporting infrastructure, your Kubernetes cluster, your pods. You need to make sure that you have visibility around this kind of infrastructure. Those kinds of platforms, there's a lot of external tools that are going to allow you to enforce a different kind of policy around workload identities, around the issuance, around what kind of clouds and workload and services and things like that are going to be able to consume those workload identities. And you're going to need to be able to make sure that, again, there's that visibility and that auditability around those, because it's going to become harder in some ways from those sort of the traditional PKI folks here. It's a much different game than using cert utils to sort of query Microsoft CA or something like that, right? You need a whole different level of tooling to be able to keep up with that scale of issuance and make sure that from those who are concerned about internal compliance and internal audit, that you have visibility around root material, around issuance of certificates, and making sure that you've got policy in place around the timeline or lifetime of those certificates, et cetera. Any questions around workload identities before we move on? Yeah.
Yeah, I got a couple.
Okay.
One, does Keyfactor plan on having some canned solutions, since a lot of these technologies have standards around how certificates are deployed? And two, if somebody moves their container from, say, Azure to Oracle, would there be some sort of audit report that would say, hey, we discovered this certificate over here, do you want to allow it? Is there a risk? Because you don't know necessarily what's going on with your environment. You just know you issued it over here. Now you see it in this space.
So The first question around the CAN solution. So I think that's that's one of the things that is really interesting about what we're seeing coming out of also the workload identity solutions and some of the surrounding platforms there, is that we are really trying, the industry is really trying to move towards more standardized solutions. I think across our platforms, from the certificate authority side, so really PKI as a service, EJBCA SaaS, and EJBCA, one of the things that we pride ourselves on is mapping to, and trying to support, all major protocol enrollment protocols via our modular RA, and being able to support, and then as well as a full-featured API to, for edge use cases and things like that. I think that we're seeing a lot of that from workload identity, where consumption is it's interesting because a lot of you are probably familiar with SCEP, EST, et cetera. We're really seeing a drive towards ACME, right, as that enrollment protocol for a lot of workload identity, not all, but a lot of workload identities. Additionally, additionally, I think that ACME doesn't quite meet some of the things around identity requirements, but there are some pretty, at this point, somewhat fast-moving drafts, IETF drafts around like revising the ACME protocol to support some more things. There's also ACME with attestation and some other things that map more towards an identity-friendly protocol that's also as agile as ACME is. So along that line, one of the things that we're trying to do is make sure that our platform, is, again, everything X509. We're going to support that, and we're going to provide interfaces so that, as all these new vendors come up, there's going to be interfaces into our platform. The other thing is that we're working with a lot of the sort of leaders in the space around workload identity to have built-in integrations to call, for instance, the EJBCA API, which that's available in the PKI as a service, EJBCA SaaS, and any other flavor of EJBCA you can imagine. So as those products become more mature, we're tracking the leaders of those platforms and making sure that they have an interface to go get a cert from our platform, right? On the question of, let's say you've got a container deployed in Azure and then it deploys in Oracle, or you're redeployed in Oracle as part of, I don't know, availability or redundancy, or you're I think there's some ways to track that. There's one of the things is those certificates are often ephemeral, so a lot of it is around making sure there's proper credentialing around the issuance of certificates. Of course, that's like always a core piece of how do I define who's allowed to get a cert and what circumstances they're allowed to get a cert. Additionally, I think for things like ingress and egress, you may want to track it through a CLM or something like that, so you can leverage metadata. So it's like if it's a critical service and it's got outside access, that you can see that, oh, this spun up from something else, have reporting and things like that in place. If you have more questions, we can hit them at the end.
I got some questions.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so the front side of that is where I have all the questions. I get the life cycle beyond and everything else. Right, this moment of proof of what it is. Usually everything is governed by, if you talk about machine identity, then you have the machine management platform that's putting on, or MDM, or whatever it is, right? Something trusted already that's handling the other. In the case of this, where it's just spawning up the temporary services, what's the proof, and the things that you've implemented so far, what's the proof that people are using that they should get a certificate? Or isn't that what makes, I don't understand the bootstrap.
Do you want to answer that, or I can jump into it?
So authenticating the issuance of a certificate for a microservice, is that what you're referring to? Yeah, so.
So like, what's the bootstrap trust in that whole happen?
Yeah, so specifically with like service meshes in general, you're configuring the trust within the service mesh config itself. So it's configured to go to the CA. It's configured for an authentication process to the CA. When I go through the demo, I'll specifically call that out where I set up a client auth cert to connect that is used for connecting into the CA for the issuance of the certificates.
So, and a couple things around Bootstrap of Trust. So that's one of the main things that the SPIFFE framework is, that's one of the main problems it solves is how to bootstrap trust, right? And then there's different implementations of that SPIFFE framework. I think a couple critical things is that, go ahead.
Also, as far as CA trust goes, that's part of the implementation process of like your service mesh where you're distributing trust of the CA chain that you want to issue certificates. So when one pod authenticates with another pod, it already has that CA trust built in as part of the
That part I can imagine.
Yep.
Yeah.
The first part is part of it.
To respond to this, so the way we are doing that as SAP, we use the established tokens, so the identity providers, for example, from AWS or Azure or wherever,
Yeah.
and we just use our CA to trade this into a standardized certificates. So we can then use our CA that's trusted within SAP and use, for example, MTLS based on client certificate. So we just use the existing identity tokens that we are provided by the hyperscalers and trade in. Of course, we have to trust this, we have to configure this in the beginning, but then
Yeah. At some point, you have at some point you have to provision some kind of trust as part of or you have to define some kind of trust as part of the provisioning of these technologies. I think one of the big things, is of course that, and something we've had a lot of conversations around is that a lot of times that trust is defined by a self-signed CA, right? And we're doing a lot of provisioning a trust chain into that. One of the things is, when we talk about bootstrapping and trust and things like that, it is this in many ways the same as like how do we trust like a Microsoft CA for auto enrollment? There are pieces there, right, where you have to have, you're providing certain credentials, there's certain trust built in order to provision one of those. Some things are powerful around workload identity is that you can, a lot of it's going to be infrastructure by code, and so then you can audit by code. So in some ways, this process you could have more built-in trust because you can audit and work through, multiple stages of checking to make sure that something is spinning up that's provisioned with that bootstrap trust. But again, it's not there's a little bit of chicken before the egg in these cases because you have to have, you need to provide some kind of credential or some kind of trust in order to get the process going, right?
But this guy's got a question, so I don't want to eat up too much.
Sure.
But it's good to see an example of something. You guys implemented a Methodist already. You can maybe show an anonymized example of someone who you think did it right, or the most efficient way, or the most foolproof way. Something that you like in general.
Okay. A lot of those, JT, we'll get to you in a second. Absolutely happy to, and maybe that's at the end. We can talk about a few of the things that we've seen in the customer space. But a lot of those metrics that you just described, foolproof, reliable, et cetera, my perspective is that is very relative to the customer. I'm serious. Like that means very different things. No, I'm absolutely serious, and a lot of it is like what industry you're in, what compliance you're trying to meet. That means very different things to a lot of different organizations. But I think it's a great question because that's one thing that a lot of companies are grappling with. Quick question here, and then I'm going to get rolling. Or maybe not a quick question, maybe a long question.
Well, I love the fact that you hit on 11 nines. You know exactly why, because we've had that conversation before. But one of the things that I see as a big challenge here is that we are talking about CAs that are potentially going to be handling stresses that they've never had to handle before. We're talking about scenarios that we haven't really necessarily had to deal with in traditional certificate management. Is there any potential for maybe even talking about spinning up almost on-demand CAs to handle these types of workloads where we're going to have very specific workload requirements?
Absolutely. That's something that we do today, that there's some there's capabilities for. You guys are PKI as a service customers. Happy to sort of talk about the possibilities there. But we do see customers who, we have an emergent use case. We need to spin up a CA. How do we do that? our platforms are really well designed to be able to accommodate that. So we can have a little more in-depth conversation about that, but that's something we do see a lot of is like, hey, I've got a new use case, I'm going to spin up a certificate of authority to serve those use cases, potentially in a dynamic manner. Sometimes, hey, this platform's going to spin up, we're going to leverage the CA, and it's going to live longer than potentially the service that's leveraging it or the cluster that's leveraging it, right? So, yeah. Do you have a battery? My battery's low.
Still have a question.
Okay.
Where is the key pair generated and private key stored for workloads?
So key pair is generated within cluster, within the workload identity engine, usually. So that's where we see workload identity being generated. There's a lot of other, like, that's, I think, one of the better, or rather, so that's usually there. Now, one of the things that we run into a lot for some of these technologies is if it's leveraging an internal CA to the platform, how is that private key generated? Where is that stored for signing? A lot of platforms don't really support consumption like that yet. And again, that's sort of putting the, DevOps doesn't include security. There's a lot of these platforms that spin up, have a CA, do not give you any way to generate it as a key in an HSM or store a key in an HSM. And oftentimes there's a lot of explanations about why that's not important, but generally that doesn't really fly with compliance, auditability, or even, I think, the baseline sort of, here's something that's best practice and here's why. So, but, okay. So, quick chat about the Keyfactor solution. So some of the things, this is not just like, hey, here's some of our products, but here's how we have customers today leveraging our products at scale, at volume, with the necessary availability, for workload identity use cases. So we have customers who leverage EJBCA for SPIRE, which I'll talk about in a second. How much time do I got here? 30. Malin, it's 2:55? Okay. Yeah, EJBCA for SPIRE, EJBCA for essentially, again, SPIFFE is a framework, right? So there are different implementations of the SPIFFE framework. One of the most popular is SPIRE because it's free, it's open source. The creators themselves have said that they feel it's missing some enterprise kind of features, but a lot of customers have forked that and built it to what they need. Other customers have built a homegrown workload identity solution based off of the SPIFFE framework, which is free and available to consume, and built it to consume certificates from EJBCA at scale. We have automotive manufacturers. How do I put this? App, very popular app service consuming EJBCA certificates for essentially either homegrown or forked SPIRE implementations. EJBCA from an availability or scalability perspective, I don't think you're going to, or rather, we're all Keyfactor customers or Keyfactor partners in one way or another here, but there's not a lot of solutions that are going to be able to meet those kinds of needs from a workload identity perspective. We've had a lot of customers who have started with something homegrown to support workload identity and then moved to EJBCA Enterprise because that's our core competency. So Keyfactor PKI service is in many ways the same way, right? Manage PKI, but serving certs in the same way. And then Keyfactor Command for visibility and monitoring and policy around certain aspects of workload identity, right? So I'm just going to move along a little quicker so we can get into Chris's demo and also have a little time for more Q&A. So really appreciate all the interactivity here. So one great example is SPIRE, right? So who here has heard of SPIRE? I know there's more of you who have heard of SPIRE, but I'm going to just look past that for right now. Thank you. So SPIRE is that open source implementation of the SPIFFE framework, right? And so that's also freely available. You can check it out, read into it, download it, or rather build it. We're technical partners with the creators of SPIFFE SPIRE. There's enterprise version that from those creators that we work with. We're not going to go too into that because I want to keep things to like things that people can consume just from this conversation here. But what SPIRE doesn't have, when we talk about some of the enterprise features that are missing, right, is that they don't have the ability to consume an external cert. So their solution is they allow the ability to provision a sub-CA get a sub-CA certificate signed from external CA. They call it the upstream authority call, right? So one of the things that we have is in the SPIRE repo, there is an EJBCA integration. So you are able to consume a sub-CA cert into SPIRE to use as a signing CA within SPIRE. So what that solves, we sort of talked about heterogeneous environments, is that allows your workload identity provider to use a common trust chain that you're also leveraging in other parts of your organization so that you eliminate some of the issues that we've seen with, I've got a self-signed CA that spins up with SPIRE. I have my enterprise or product certificate authorities that I run with EJBCA or maybe another CA. And I now have to provision this self-signed CA trust into all kinds of places, my 3 clouds, my data center, et cetera, for us to be able, for there to be trust between enterprise or device product certificate authorities and workload identity, right? One of the bad things about SPIRE is, and I think that's still the case, I might have seen some pull requests, but no HSM integration. So I think no ability to store that when that CSR for that sub-C is generated, no ability to store it in the HSM. But you're able to at least solve some of the trust issues, or a lot of the trust issues around workload identity between clouds by leveraging a centralized, powerful certificate authority platform to be able to get your certificate authority into something like SPIRE, right? Another great example, and I'm actually going to so that we don't have to keep switching back and forth between laptops. Another great example is leveraging EJBCA for trust between, for instance, service mesh that's deployed in multiple clouds, or even just multiple clusters, right? So that's a problem that we had a lot of customers coming to us with, is we're on a service mesh journey. We've got multiple clusters running service mesh, and this is something that we do ourselves. So this is something that we use in our production environments, is we use service mesh, Istio. We power it with EJBCA for our own SaaS products, right? But you're able to provide a common trust chain and commonality between certificates issued from that trust chain as the MTLS certs for your service meshes across clusters. Now that could be clusters in the same cloud, across cloud, hybrid, whatever, but that allows for at least that trust to be applied across heterogeneous environments. Chris will show some of the bootstrapping and provisioning around how to do that. It's, I hope people love command line and very little graphics, because that's what it looks like. But that I hope everyone understands that. That's where we are. There's no flashy graphics yet. There's resources here. So EJBCA is an external PKI for Istio. Command is a cert manager Istio, and that commonality around provisioning via and these slides will be available. Also in the garage, there are handouts. Chris and I will be there as well with QR codes directly to these pages. EJBCA is a cert manager issuer, and there's also if you go to the SPIRE repo, there is a documentation for the EJBCA integration. So you can, if you deploy your SPIRE instance, you can point in EJBCA and be off to the races with EJBCA integration, provisioning, getting a sub-CA cert signed from an EJBCA. So pretty nifty. Okay, so no applause yet. I know you guys were on the, but we're going to swap over to the demo here. So apologies. There's going to be a minute where we flip over.
Yep, and I think I'm just going to run it from my laptop.
Are you?
Yeah, because I want to be able to show EJBCA.
Any questions quick questions while Chris is getting spun up here? Malin, anything you want to say?
But it's, I mean, like you say, we have all these conversations with these vendors, like Keyfactor, IO that implement Istio, but also companies that implement sort of SPIFFE, SPIRE also. And I think this is where we are also learning from each other, coming from a more mature guy, learning over the last 20 years. They have actually things to learn to continue to have their solutions.
And Chris is going to run you through this. One thing I did want to mention is, of course, why service mesh is part of this conversation and why we're bringing up Istio is Istio has the implementation of SPIFFE. So they use the SPIFFE workload, the SPIFFE framework as their workload identity provider within Istio service mesh, right? So that's we hook EJBCA up to it. Go ahead, Chris.
Yep. So for the Istio demo install that I'm going to show, I actually configured it to go to EJBCA, but if you have PKI as a service, you could also configure it to go to command and issue certs from our PKI as a service platform, or if you have command on-prem, it works with a different cert manager issuer.
I'm going to say one thing. Chris had a pre-recorded video that he was going to work through, but he heard something from the audience or from me or just internally that said he was going to. Oh, you are going with the video.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
No,
I
I thought we were going to do it live. I got really excited.
Yeah. So
I just always love seeing the demo gods smite someone down. Like it's like it all broke. The cluster's not
Yep.
starting. All
yeah.
right, go
So
ahead.
how do we look here? Okay.
Uh-oh.
Is it? Can you everybody read that? It's command line.
It is pretty tiny.
Down the room lights a little bit, if you can.
This is a bunch of PKI admins. None of us have good eyes.
All right, so first off, this is all deployed via Helm. EJBCA was deployed via Helm. And I went in and configured the CA, configured the identity profiles. These are all 3-day certificates that we're issuing here, and they're automatically being rotated. So to start the install, we'll go ahead and get started. And first, I'll add the Helm repos. And you'll see here that there's Cert Manager, there's the EJBCA issuer, and I believe Istio. Next thing I'm doing is I'm installing Cert Manager. Cert Manager in this deployment is going to be used as the back end to facilitate the issuance of certificates. After this is being installed, then I install the EJBCA issuer, and that's our custom plugin with Cert Manager that allows you to go to EJBCA for those certificates.
Chris, can I interrupt for a second?
Yep.
One of the biggest things is that, and again, we got the question around, which I thought was a great question, is like, what are we doing to make sure that our platforms can be consumed? As you can see here, so Istio, the service mesh, and not, every workload identity provider is a little different, but in this case, Istio can use Cert Manager that provides a whole host of integration options. We actually have multiple ways of integrating to Cert Manager via the Acme, what they call the Acme custom issuer, so we can accept an Acme enrollment from Cert Manager. We have, if you go to the Cert Manager page, certmanager.io, you'll see that there is an EJBCA and a command custom issuer, so it can call the EJBCA API or the Keyfactor command API. So this is how we're making sure that no matter what solutions come out in the marketplace, right? Whether it's a new service provider, a workload identity provider, a new service mesh, that we're trying to keep up, hopefully keeping up, right? With and we're involved in all these working groups and things like that to make sure that we're mapping to the integration methods that are going to come out. In this case, for Istio, and we see a lot of Cert Manager. I'm sure you guys do too. But we're making sure that we're providing multiple avenues to go get a cert from the certificate authority into something like this.
All right, so the Helm chart for EJBCA, the EJBCA Cert Manager issuer has been installed. We're going to set that up here. I've imported a secret with the CA to make that MTLS or that TLS connection to eJBCA, so I'm trusting the cert that's being used as the front-end API cert. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to set the credentials. So this is the authentication into eJBCA, and here it's the cert and the key. There's a couple different ways about doing this. For this demo, I just created a secret. You can have other secrets, like I think Vault has an integration where you can store the secret in Vault. Kubernetes will go to that and get that secret.
That's sort of like the SAP integration, right? Like where you've got a token that can access a secret vault that's secured external to the platform that you're standing up. And you leverage that token or that credential, and that can be short-lived, whatever pieces you place around that to go to a vault and get a secret. So that's one way to do it, right? When we talk about bootstrapping to provision that trust.
You can also use OAuth if that's the method you prefer. So you could set up an OAuth client ID and rotate those as well. For this, I'm just using CertAuth into eJBCA. Okay, next up, we're going to go ahead and install the cluster issuer. So this is a YAML file. It's just like any other cluster issuer or issuer. It basically tells when you send in the request from Istio, in this case, to Cert Manager said, okay, I need this issuer, this group, et cetera. And so that's what we're doing here. Here we are creating the secret excuse me, I didn't get that in time, but the previous command was installing the CA trust that the Istio CSR or the CSR integration, Cert Manager Istio CSR integration will use to distribute that CA trust across various namespaces within your Kubernetes cluster. And I believe right now we're going to install the Istio CSR integration. So that gets deployed, and we'll check it to make sure everything's good there. Oh, no, installing Istio base first. Now we'll check. Yeah, so we're just going to check the pods and make sure the Istio CSR is up and running. And it is. Next up, we're going to install the Istio CNI. So if you have a service mesh that uses like Calico, you'll need to have that CNI provider installed, the Istio CNI integration installed, so that networking is configured properly. Now we're installing the actual Istio release. And you can see here, it's all deployed via Helm. If you want to meet me over here, I can go through the YAML files. It's very easy to set those up. It's basically a few lines of code within the YAML file that points it to Cert Manager. We're actually, within that YAML file, we're turning off the built-in CA that gets installed as part of Istio. When you just do a default install, it stands up a self-signed CA. So I'm turning that off within the YAML file, and then I'm pointing Istio to Cert Manager, which is pointed to eJBCA cluster issuer for certificates. And next, where's my mouse? There we go. Now we're going to get the pods in the Istio system, make sure everything's running there. And finally, we'll deploy the Istio ingress gateway, which is configured from a YAML file, but it also pulls in the Envoy configs from Istio as part of the process, and it is issued a certificate from eJBCA. And now the install is going, and it's deployed, and we'll go ahead and check the pods, make sure everything or the pod is, make sure everything is deployed and up and running. It is. And then we'll check the logs. Oop. Oh, did it go? Hold on.
Uh-oh,
Yeah, let me just,
you restarted the video.
yeah, I know, hold on.
Yeah.
Escape. And
Even
let's
with the
see.
video, sometimes the demo gods get you.
Yeah, even with the video. All right, so oh, it's not going to do it. Okay, so we'll go there. There we go. All right, so I want to show the logs. Hold on. Okay, here we go. Now we're checking the logs for the gateway. And you'll see here that the Envoy proxy is ready. You'll see the command that it did to configure it. And I'm trying to see, yeah, and you'll see in here it's about 5 up from the bottom or 6 up from the bottom where it says root cert has changed. So it's automatically updated the CA trust for that ingress gateway pod. Next up, I deployed the book info application just so we can see the MTL asserts within eJBCA in the next slide. So we're creating the namespace. We're tagging that namespace with and turning on Istio injection so that Istio will monitor that and stand up the sidecars that will be issued certificates from eJBCA. And I'm going to go through it a little bit here. I think I'll skip ahead just a few minutes. But basically, I'm getting the sidecar proxy container name, and then the pod, and then I'm going to look at one of these pods in the Envoy proxy container so that I can make sure that the certificate, the CA cert trust was rotated and updated, and that everything's functioning within the Envoy proxy. And you'll see there, Envoy proxy is enabled. The root cert was changed and rotated. And it returned there's the stuff for the trust anchor and all that stuff in there. Any questions so far? So here you'll see the identity certs that were issued, the workload identity certs. So there's identity certs for all of the book info pods, product page, reviews, ratings, details. You'll also see underneath that the Istio gateway cert, a certificate that was issued to the Istio system, as well as the cert manager certificate that was also issued to the Istio CSR proxy. Any questions? That concludes the demo portion. Istio is one of the ones that we have a guide for. Glue also uses Istio and Cert Manager. So if you're using that, you can do the same thing here. And all of these certificates are issued off of eJBCA, and the eJBCA instance is acting as a subordinate CA outside of the cluster. So you don't have to have that self-signed CA that Istio prepackages with their product as part of the default install.
We have customers today who are leveraging this exact integration and using an eJBCA with a private key protected by an HSM That trust chain is deployed in part of the Istio bootstrapping process to be trusted within that service mesh. And all the MTLS certs for Istio are essentially provisioned from an EJBCA issuing CA. You have visibility. You can see what kind of certs are being provisioned. From the entity profile, you're enacting control around what kind of certs can be provisioned based on the credentials and the identity that you're leveraging to go enroll for those certs. And you've got full control over the trust chain, over the certificates that are going out to your service mesh.
Yeah.
And as Chris mentioned, one of the cool things is you can actually go to our website, and again, we'll be sending this deck out to all the attendees. But as well, if you want to come out to the garage, we have a QR code that you can scan that will get you to the tutorial, and you can walk through all of this yourself. And actually, you can leverage Istio and open source and EJBCA. You can even use EJBCA community. Obviously, in both Istio and EJBCA, there are enterprise features that you'll want to leverage as an enterprise.
Yes, ma'am.
Just one comment, not a question. I think one important thing we have to consider is workload identities and certificates, which is different from user or machine certificates, is because they are short-lived, you don't have to worry about the location anymore.
Yep.
So the beginning you showed the EJBCA is configured for CRLs, but you don't need this. These are just really short-lived certificates, so you don't need to revoke them, and you can't revoke them,
Yeah.
so you don't have to worry about
Perfect. Yeah.
CRLs and all this
Did-
stuff. This is done.
Did everyone hear that? Yeah. Okay. I just didn't know. Yeah. Super, that's a great comment. I think one of we see that where there's ephemeral certs take a lot out of again you don't the whole revocation is really that they're short-lived, right? The shorter lived in some ways the better, but then there's an operational part of that where 30 minutes is not really great, but yeah. It's all about appetite for risk as well internally. So, 1 week.
1 week.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't require location. It's short-lived or less than 1 week.
Yeah.
You can see here in the screenshot that I had, or this is actually my CA here. You'll see that there's the certificate number. There's 1 of 8. So this has been issued. There's certificates that have been issued over the past few days. That have since expired or been replaced or rotated out. And getting back to the SPIFFE SPIRE stuff, you'll notice that here that even though we're using Istio is leveraging that SPIFFE framework, and you'll see it in the URI, and in EJBCA, you'll see it in the URI and the certificate, as well as the subject alternative name in the form of URI entry.
Okay. We have 1 minute, but maybe do we have someone else next in this room or? Oh, it's a break. Okay. Okay. I think yeah.
Yeah.
So then, I would say thank you. I mean,
Yeah.
should we leave it in the garage and
We'll be posted up in the garage. So if anyone wants to chat more workload identity or has any questions about anything we talked about, or maybe even questions about something we didn't talk about, please come. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Oh,
I will say one more thing. In this demo, the CA keys are stored in the HSM because only the identities are being generated within the cluster, within Istio.